Picture this. You're living in colonial America, and your neighbor starts acting strangely. Maybe she's talking to herself, or perhaps he's become convinced that the British are sending secret messages through his breakfast porridge. What happens next? Well, if you thought medieval torture was bad, wait until you hear what American doctors did in the name of curing mental illness. Welcome to a journey through one of the darkest chapters in American medical history. Today, we're going to explore the absolutely insane pun-intended methods that doctors, psychiatrists, and medical professionals used to treat mental illness in America from colonial times through the 20th century. From chains and cages to ice water baths, from surgical lobotomies performed with ice picks to spinning chairs designed to make you vomit. American medical history is filled with treatments that seem more like medieval torture than modern medicine. And just remember, this isn't fiction. This actually happened. These were real people in real hospitals being subjected to real treatments that doctors genuinely believed would help them. So buckle up, because we're about to dive into the terrifying world of early American psychiatry. Trust me, after this, you'll be incredibly grateful for modern mental health care, flawed as it may be. Colonial America. The devil made me do IT. Let's start at the beginning. In colonial America, from the 1600s through the early 1700s, mental illness wasn't really understood as a medical condition at all. Instead, it was seen as either a moral failing, a punishment from God, or most terrifyingly, evidence of demonic possession. The Puritans, who made up a large portion of early American settlers, had a particularly harsh view of mental illness. They believed in predestination and saw the world in stark terms of good versus evil. If someone started behaving strangely, it wasn't because of a chemical imbalance in their brain or trauma from their past. No, it was because they were either being punished by God for their sins, or they had become possessed by the devil himself. This belief system led to some truly horrific outcomes. The most famous example is, of course, the Salem witch trials of 1692. In Salem, Massachusetts, several young girls began having fits, screaming uncontrollably, throwing things, and speaking in tongues. Today, we might recognize these symptoms as evidence of epilepsy, ergot poisoning, a fungus that grows on rye, and can cause hallucinations and convulsions, or even post-traumatic stress disorder. But in 1692, the Puritans had a different explanation: witchcraft. Over the course of several months, more than 200 people were accused of witchcraft, and 20 were executed, most by hanging, though one man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death under heavy stones. Many of those accused and executed were likely suffering from what we would now recognize as mental illness. But it wasn't just Salem. Throughout colonial America, people with mental illness were treated as criminals, sinners, or demons. They were often locked in cellars or attics, chained to walls, and left to languish in their own filth. Families who could afford it might hire someone to watch their mentally ill relative, essentially, a jailer who would keep them confined and out of sight. For those without families to care for them, the options were even worse. They might be sold into indentured servitude, where they would be worked like slaves. Or they might be left to wander the streets as beggars and vagrants, subject to arrest and imprisonment at any moment. Some colonial towns actually had cages or pens specifically designed to hold the mentally ill. These were outdoor enclosures, often made of wood or iron bars, where people would be displayed like animals at a zoo. Townspeople would sometimes gather to gawk at the lunatics or throw things at them for entertainment. It was a brutal time to have a mental illness in America. But believe it or not, things were about to get even worse. The rise of the asylum. 18th and early 19th century. By the mid-1700s, American attitudes toward mental illness began to shift slightly. The Enlightenment was in full swing, and new ideas about science, reason, and human nature were spreading across the Atlantic from Europe. Doctors and philosophers began to argue that mental illness might not be caused by demonic possession after all. It might actually be a medical condition that could be studied and treated. This sounds like progress, right? And in some ways, it was. But the treatments that emerged from this new understanding were often just as brutal as what came before. In 1752, the Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia opened what is generally considered to be America's first psychiatric ward. Benjamin Franklin was one of its founders, and the hospital was designed to provide care for the sick poor, including those with mental illness. But the care provided there would shock modern sensibilities. Patients were kept in cells in the basement, dark, damp rooms with stone walls and barred windows. They slept on straw mattresses that were rarely changed. They were often kept in chains to prevent them from harming themselves or others. And they were subjected to a variety of medical treatments that were supposed to cure their madness. One popular treatment was called bloodletting. This ancient practice, which dates back to the Greeks and Romans, was based on the theory that illness was caused by an imbalance of the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If someone was mentally ill, doctors reasoned it must be because they had too much blood, which was causing pressure on the brain. The solution? Drain some of that blood out. Doctors would make incisions in the patient's arms or legs and let them bleed into a bowl. Sometimes they would use leeches, small worm-like creatures that latch onto the skin and suck blood. The idea was that removing this excess blood would restore balance to the body and cure the mental illness. Of course, this didn't work. In fact, it often made things worse. Patients who were already weak and malnourished would become even weaker from blood loss. Some died from the procedure, but doctors kept doing it anyway, convinced that they were providing cutting-edge medical care. Another popular treatment was called purging. This involved giving patients powerful laxatives or emetics, substances that make you vomit, to cleanse their bodies of the bad humors that were supposedly causing their illness. Patients would be given doses of mercury, antimony, or ipecac, all of which are toxic, and would spend hours or days vomiting and experiencing severe diarrhea. Again, this didn't cure mental illness. It just made sick people sicker. But doctors were convinced they were on the right track. Perhaps the most bizarre treatment of this era was Benjamin Rush's tranquilizing chair. Rush, who is often called the father of American psychiatry, invented this device in the early 1800s while working at the Pennsylvania Hospital. The chair was designed to restrict all movement while simultaneously reducing blood flow to the brain. Here is how it worked. The patient would be strapped into the chair with their arms and legs bound. A box would be placed over their head to block out light and sound. Then the chair would be tilted backward, causing blood to flow away from the head. The patient would be kept in this position for hours or even days at a time. Rush believed that this would tranquilize the patient and calm their overactive mind. In reality, it was just a form of sensory deprivation and physical restraint that often left patients terrified and traumatized. But Rush didn't stop there. He also invented a device called the gyrator, or rotating chair. This was essentially a chair mounted on a rotating platform. The patient would be strapped in, and then the chair would be spun around rapidly, sometimes up to 100 rotations per minute. The theory was that this spinning would redistribute blood and other fluids in the body, thereby curing mental illness. In practice, it made patients violently nauseous and dizzy. Many would vomit. Some would pass out. A few even died when the spinning caused brain hemorrhages. And yet, these treatments were considered state-of-the-art medicine at the time. Rush's methods were adopted by asylums across the country and remained in use for decades. The age of the asylum, MID 19th century. Why by the mid-1800s, a new movement was sweeping across America: moral treatment. This was the brainchild of reformers like Dorothea Dix, who traveled the country documenting the horrible conditions in which mentally ill people were kept. Dix testified before state legislatures, showing them evidence of people chained in cellars, locked in cages, and left to freeze in unheated rooms. Her work led to a wave of asylum construction across the United States. Between 1840 and 1880, nearly every state built at least one large public asylum designed specifically to house and treat the mentally ill. These asylums were supposed to be havens of compassion and healing, places where patients could recover in a peaceful, structured environment. And at first, many of them were. The early asylums followed the principles of moral treatment, which emphasized kindness, meaningful work, and a regular routine. Patients were given jobs to do gardening, cooking, cleaning, to give them a sense of purpose. They were encouraged to spend time outdoors, to exercise, and to engage in recreational activities. Physical restraints were minimized, and harsh punishments were discouraged. For a brief moment in American history, it seemed like we were actually making progress in how we treated mental illness. But it didn't last. As the 19th century wore on, asylums became overcrowded. More and more people were being committed, not just those with severe mental illness, but also people with epilepsy, developmental disabilities, or even just eccentric behavior. Immigrants who couldn't speak English were sometimes diagnosed as idiots and locked away. Women who defied their husbands or fathers might be committed for hysteria or moral insanity. The asylums, which had been designed to house a few hundred patients in comfortable, therapeutic environments, soon held thousands. Funding couldn't keep up with the growing population. Staff-to-patient ratios plummeted. The ideals of moral treatment were abandoned in favor of simple warehousing. And as conditions deteriorated, the treatments became more brutal. Restraints came back into fashion, but now they were scientific restraints. There were straitjackets, of course, but also muffs, leather mittens that prevented patients from using their hands. There were cribs, cage-like beds with locking lids that imprisoned patients inside. There were strong chairs, wooden chairs with built-in restraints for the arms, legs, and torso. Patients who were deemed difficult or violent might be kept in these restraints for days, weeks, or even months at a time. They would eat, sleep, and relieve themselves while bound. The restraints would chafe their skin, causing painful sores and infections. Some patients lost circulation in their limbs and developed gangrene. And then there were the water cures. Hydrotherapy, as it was officially called, was based on the idea that water could shock the system and restore mental balance. There were many variations of this treatment, but most involved subjecting patients to extreme temperatures. In the bath of surprise, a patient would be walking down a hallway when suddenly, without warning, a trapdoor would open beneath their feet, and they would plunge into a pool of ice-cold water below. The shock was supposed to jolt them back to sanity. In the douche, patients would be stripped naked and strapped to a wall, while attendants blasted them with high-pressure jets of ice-cold water. This could go on for hours. In the continuous bath, patients would be placed in a tub of water, sometimes warm, sometimes cold, and kept there for days, or even weeks at a time. A canvas cover would be placed over the tub, with just a hole for the patient's head to poke through. They would eat, sleep, and defecate in the tub. The idea was that the prolonged immersion would have a calming effect. Many patients developed pneumonia from these water treatments. Some drowned when attendants left them unattended. Others developed severe skin conditions from spending so long in water. But the doctors kept prescribing these treatments, convinced they were helping. The industrial age of psychiatry, late 19th and early 20th centuries and days in America, entered the industrial age. Psychiatry became more scientific and more mechanized. New technologies were developed specifically to treat mental illness, and many of them were every bit as brutal as what came before. One of the most popular devices was the uterine elevator. Yes, you read that right. In the late 1800s, many doctors believed that women's mental illness was caused by a wandering womb. The idea that the uterus could move around inside the body and press on other organs, causing all sorts of problems. The solution? A device that would literally lift and hold the uterus in place. This involved inserting a metal rod through the vagina and positioning it against the cervix, then using a system of straps and pulleys to pull the rod upward, thereby elevating the uterus. As you might imagine, this was excruciatingly painful and caused serious internal injuries. But it was routinely performed on women diagnosed with hysteria, neurasthenia, or female troubles. For men, there were different devices. The electric belt was a leather belt with metal plates that delivered electrical shocks to the lower abdomen and genitals. It was supposed to cure a wide range of mental ailments, from depression to excessive masturbation, which was considered a mental illness at the time. And then there was insulin shock therapy. Developed in the 1930s by Austrian psychiatrist Manfred Sakel, insulin shock therapy involved injecting patients with massive doses of insulin to induce a hypoglycemic coma. The patient would slip into unconsciousness. Their blood sugar would plummet to dangerously low levels, and they would sometimes experience seizures. After an hour or so in this comatose state, they would be brought back with an injection of glucose. The theory was that the coma would somehow reset the brain and cure mental illness. In practice, it was incredibly dangerous. Patients often didn't wake up from the coma. Even when they did, the treatment could cause permanent brain damage. But insulin shock therapy remained a standard treatment in American mental hospitals throughout the 1940s and 1950s. Around the same time, doctors also began experimenting with metrazole therapy. This involved injecting patients with a drug called metrazole, also known as pentyletrozole, which causes violent seizures. The seizures were so intense that patients often broke their own bones or bit through their tongues. The theory behind metrazole therapy was that inducing a seizure would somehow cure schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders. There was no real scientific basis for this. It was essentially just trial and error. But it became widely used in American mental hospitals in the 1930s and early 1940s. Both insulin shock and metrazole therapy were eventually replaced by something that is still used today, electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT. Now, ECT has gotten a bad rap over the years, partly because of how it was depicted in movies like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And to be fair, when it was first introduced in the 1930s, it was pretty brutal. Patients were not given anesthesia or muscle relaxants. They were simply strapped to a table, electrodes were placed on their temples, and a powerful electric shock was sent through their brain. This caused a massive seizure. Their whole body would convulse. But thorazine and other early antipsychotic drugs came with serious side effects. They caused severe muscle stiffness, tremors, and involuntary movements, a condition called tardive dyskinesia. They made patients feel sedated and zombified, and they were often given in much higher doses than necessary, essentially being used as chemical straitjackets to keep patients docile and manageable. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, other psychiatric medications were developed: antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, mood stabilizers. These drugs helped millions of people and are still widely used today. But they were often overprescribed and misused. Patients in mental hospitals were given powerful drug cocktails that left them barely functional. Women who complained to their doctors about feeling unhappy or stressed were handed prescriptions for Valium or Librium drugs that were highly addictive and caused severe withdrawal symptoms. The mother's little helper phenomenon of the 1960s and 1970s, immortalized in the Rolling Stones song of the same name, was a real problem. Millions of American women became dependent on benzodiazepines prescribed to them by doctors who saw any female emotion as a problem to be medicated. Deinstitutionalization and its consequences. 1960S-1980SB. Why the 1960s? America's mental hospitals had become overcrowded, underfunded warehouses where patients languished in terrible conditions. Investigative journalists began documenting these conditions, and the public was horrified by what they saw. At the same time, new medications made it possible for many patients to manage their symptoms outside of a hospital setting. And there was a growing movement toward patients' rights and civil liberties. All of this led to a policy shift called deinstitutionalization, starting in the 1960s and accelerating through the 1970s and 1980s. Thousands of patients were released from mental hospitals. Many state institutions were closed entirely. The idea was that these patients would receive care in their communities through outpatient clinics, group homes, and other support services. But here's the problem. Those community services were never adequately funded or implemented. Patients were released from hospitals with nowhere to go and no support system. Many ended up homeless. Many ended up in prison. The transinstitutionation, from mental hospitals to jails, has been called one of the great failures of American social policy. Even today, the largest mental health facilities in America are county jails. Cook County Jail in Chicago, Rikers Island in New York, and the Los Angeles County Jail each house more people with mental illness than any psychiatric hospital in the country. Modern controversies. 198OS present in the 1980s and 1990s. A new generation of psychiatric medications was developed, including drugs like Prozac, Risperidone, and Zyprexa. These drugs were heavily marketed as being safer and more effective than earlier medications. But they too came with serious side effects, including massive weight gain, diabetes, and in some cases, increased risk of suicide. And they were often prescribed to children and adolescents without adequate testing of their long-term effects. The pharmaceutical industry's influence over psychiatry became a major concern. Drug companies funded research, paid doctors to promote their products, and downplayed negative findings about side effects. The overprescription of psychiatric medications to children became a national scandal. At the same time, there were important advances. New forms of therapy, like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, proved to be highly effective for many conditions. There was growing recognition of the importance of trauma in mental illness, leading to trauma-informed care approaches. But even today, serious problems remain. People with mental illness are still stigmatized and discriminated against. They're more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators, but media coverage suggests the opposite. They face barriers to employment, housing, and health care. And in some corners of the mental health system, coercive and damaging practices continue. Troubled teen programs that use harsh discipline and isolation. Restraint and seclusion in psychiatric facilities that can cause serious harm or even death. The use of powerful psychiatric medications on nursing home residents to keep them quiet and manageable. Where does this leave us? Looking back at the history of mental illness treatment in America is deeply uncomfortable. The bloodletting, the spinning chairs, the ice water baths, the lobotomies, all of it seems barbaric from our modern perspective. But we need to remember that the doctors and asylum workers who performed these treatments weren't monsters. They were products of their time, working with the knowledge and tools available to them. They genuinely believed they were helping people. That's actually the scariest part. These weren't sadists who enjoyed hurting people. They were respectable professionals doing what they thought was best. Which raises an important question. What treatments are we using today that future generations will look back on with horror? Will they be shocked that we used electroconvulsive therapy? That we prescribed powerful drugs with serious side effects to children? That we locked people in solitary confinement as a form of treatment? We can't know for sure, but we can learn from history. The key lessons seem to be 1. Humility. We don't know as much as we think we do. Medical knowledge is constantly evolving. 2. Compassion. Even when we don't understand someone's illness, we can treat them with dignity and respect. 3. Skepticism. Just because something is considered cutting-edge science doesn't mean it works or is safe. 4. Patient autonomy. People deserve to have a say in their own treatment, even when they're mentally ill. Mental health treatment has come a long way since colonial America. We no longer chain people in cellars or drill holes in their heads to let out evil spirits. Modern psychiatry has helped millions of people live fuller, happier lives. But we're not done improving. There's still work to do to ensure that everyone who needs mental health care can get it, that treatments are evidence-based and humane, and that people with mental illness are treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. Because if there's one thing the history of American psychiatry teaches us, it's this: we're all just one generation away from looking barbaric to our descendants. The best we can do is keep learning, keep improving, and never forget that behind every diagnosis is a human being who deserves compassion. Thank you for joining me on this disturbing journey through American psychiatric history. If you found this informative, please subscribe for more content exploring the darker corners of history. And if you or someone you know is struggling with mental illness, please reach out for help. Despite all the mistakes and horrors of the past, there are good treatments available today, and things can get better. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and be grateful you weren't born 200 years ago.